Welcome to Sonder Scheme's Ethics Masterclass Introduction. We're going to talk through the 7 things that we think are important with AI ethics: privacy, bias, explainability, justifiability, accountability, equality, and agency. AI changes how we need to think about privacy. Instead of thinking about inputs, what we volunteer to a company, we need to think about outputs, what they infer about us. AI uses our data and the data of others to make inferences. And this data is different because it's passive, unintentional, unavoidable. It's often alien. Mouse clicks, eye tracking, things humans can't process, working outside of our conscious awareness. It's also third-party data, things others say about us on social media, for example. Inferring things about us is now common practice in big business. It's what we think about when we hear personalization, but we often don't think about what's gone into that personalization. Netflix infers race from viewing behavior, for example, and uses this information to display different movie artwork. There seem to be no limits to how sensitive this can be. Google can infer that someone has Alzheimer's from their search. Facebook has inferred sexual orientation and has in the past used it to serve ads for gay cures. Amazon can infer health status from voice, which enables ordering of medicine. Our affinities and our preferences are predicted, and the more predictable, the better. And it can be highly sensitive. Our personal data reveals our hesitations and doubts, or what others think, or what biases and patterns exist between us and others. An important intuitive link is broken. You no longer know what the link is between what you know about yourself and what others are inferring about you. Which begs the question, do you have the right to know these inferences, and do you have the right to understand what biases went into them? The world is biased. Humans are biased. And over the past few years, concern over AI bias has risen and is now fairly and squarely in our mindsets. There have been high-profile cases across many industries and use cases: credit approval, housing advertising, recruitment. There are clear cases of definitive harm, often to already vulnerable people. But fixing AI bias isn't necessarily easy, just the same as fixing human bias isn't necessarily easy. Bias in image search is an example of how AI, while representing quote-unquote facts about the world, does so in a biased way. A famous example is Google's image search for CEO. In 2015, researchers from the University of Washington found that only 11% of the people returned in a Google image search for CEO were women, while 7% of CEOs in the US were women at the time. And this kind of bias illustrates just how not neutral search is. And in order to adjust for bias, humans have to step in. In many respects, expecting AI to be unbiased is just not realistic, and it may be counter to technology goals. Some designers even consider bias to be, in some ways, a design material, that a bias is revealed in the act of noticing a new or a novel, unique need. It maybe can be helpful. It's possible that, used wisely, that AI can reveal biases to us, enabling us to act on them and make progress. Explainability is a really important part of AI design, and we can now consider a lot of things about explainability to be essentially UX design, that an AI is able to explain itself, because humans demand that machines must explain themselves, and there are trade-offs. What is the right level of explainability? How do humans like things to be explained? What are the technical solutions and human complexities of explainability? It's a core part. And there are tools and methodologies that help with this now. We know that explanations from a machine are a different kind of experience than explanations from a human, but getting no explanation is infuriating and antithetical to trustworthiness. In late 2019, Apple's seemingly unfair and sexist credit decisions set off a fury of algorithmic rage. The company's lack of joint accounts for its Apple Card forced married couples to apply for 2 accounts rather than 1 account that they had applied for through other card companies. Comparing the results exposed a bias that Apple awarded some men credit limits that were 10 to 20x their female spouses. The issue was initially exposed by David Heinemeier Hansen on Twitter, and his prominence as creator of Ruby on Rails and founder of Basecamp helped ensure that his tweet storm was not ignored. Now, a husband receiving 20x the credit limit of his wife just doesn't seem right. Intuitively, if two people share tax returns, accounts, and assets, they should have the same credit worthiness. That's the mental model that we bring to these things. But clearly that's not actually how this worked. And while the lack of explanation was infuriating, it was the next step to justification that was really what took it off on Twitter. There was no step to any kind of human level justification and no human response. And Goldman Sachs' answer was also unsatisfying. And this no explanation, no justification aren't just a recipe for customer dissatisfaction. They invite all sorts of pushback and they erode trust in AI. There's even a more insidious component to justification, and that's the fact base that sits behind it. Many AI products have that we need to consider much more about causality and about the scientific base that's sitting behind any justification. So that's something that we strongly encourage in design. The next part of this is accountability. Take the Apple Card case again. The accountability was a mess. Some commentators on Twitter highlighted that Goldman Sachs, as the bank behind the Apple Card, was responsible for credit scoring. This is likely true, but it was Apple that created the brand contract with its customers. It was Apple who serviced the customers, and it means it's Apple's issue to fix. And the problem isn't the algorithm. It's doing what it was told to do. The problem is the people who manage the algorithm. They aren't telling the algorithm to do the right thing. Apple and Goldman Sachs needed to create a system that set the right boundaries for AI design and provides management processes to govern and hold the right people accountable. Equality has multiple angles in the age of AI. I just want to focus on one here because I think it's illustrative. It's what happens when we encode things that traditionally have not been subject to computation. AI enables many problems to be seen as computationally optimizable. And when we do this with social factors, we create a techno-social solution. This can transform things that were previously egalitarian into things that are not. This means that there's a fundamental shift in power from the users of any social system to the designers of the replacement techno-social system. A great example is how equality in the transport system might shift as we transition to self-driving cars. Now, currently, roads are first come, first served, with a few exceptions such as emergency vehicles and toll roads and HOV lanes. But imagine a scenario in the future where the roads have been optimized to reduce congestion. You're taking your kid to their soccer game, but it's busy, and there are restrictions on who can travel. Suddenly, you're competing with an executive who's in a rush to get to an important business meeting. Who gets to move? If we measure the output of society by economics and GDP alone, or if the designer of the system sells cars and predicts the value of your trip to be lower than the executives because the exec is more likely to buy another car, you're going to miss that game. The point is, no matter what techno-social systems, what AI is about now. Previously incomputable problems are now available to computation, which means that many human-level systems of the past, where simply showing up was enough, are now optimized by the few for the many. There's a fundamental question of who has the power and who gets to decide. Finally, agency. Agency refers to our capacity to act independently and make our own free choices. In democratic societies, this is a central value. Society values human agency, and this brings a lot of messy inefficiency. Society and its institutions don't actually optimize, even though it feels like they do. It sounds counterintuitive, but the social value of leaving a wide range of opportunities open for the future generally exceeds the value that society could realize by trying to optimize in the present. Our default in the US is to leave things undetermined. We need to play and to explore, to be unpredictable, and to have unpredictability. In fact, it's what fosters human connection. If we had no problems to solve, we had no reason to work together. If everything was predictable, we wouldn't need to work together and we wouldn't need to build connections. People ask why AI is different. It's because it's role creating. It learns from data, creates its own knowledge that we struggle to understand. So it can interferes with our agencies in ways we can't detect in the moment, and is often working towards an objective that's contrary to ours because it's aiming for predictability, whereas we may not necessarily be aiming for that. One of the central inequalities and problems with agency that we have now is that others know more about us than we know about ourselves. That can happen with over-personalization. And as we continue to outsource our cognition and autonomy to machines, we do risk passivity, ignorance, detachment, and dependence. This doesn't mean that that AI isn't useful or helpful, and it doesn't mean that we can't use it to better ourselves and our societies, but it does mean that it needs to be designed differently. It does need to be designed with knowledge and information about ourselves about users passed back to users to be able to be governed and controlled in all cases. And it does making sure that human-centered design is about keeping human bias over machine bias. So when I say that, I mean that we bias human learning over machine learning, and that we are biased towards human flourishing and human experience. I hope you enjoyed this section. There is a white paper that we wrote on AI ethics, which is worth reading. It gives a lot more detail into each of these areas. And then, of course, as you move through the design system, there are techniques, tools, and more information on this rapidly changing, interesting area. Thank you.